I got the rare chance to play through earlier versions of a source mod recently. I was given access to the July 2020 and February 2021 versions of the Burton Equation, a source mod that eventually released in December 2024. So we're looking at over 4 years of development time between the assembly of the July build and what we got to play in December. It's exciting though, there's a ton to cover, and it really shows the development of a source mod, how things can change, and most importantly, how things can improve. You can really shape things up in that time period, and it's fascinating to see what the early versions of the mod looked like compared to the final, because the image for the mod, it seems like the overall concept for it was about the same. The same number of levels are there, the same concepts for the levels are present, a lot of the same guns are there. It just seems like the stuff that isn't present just hadn't been implemented in time when those builds were made. Everything else lines up. The vision for the mod was pretty much the same. The idea of a noir detective traveling through time to the 1920s, the 40s, the 80s, and then to the Half-Life 2 timeline. It's just that the direction it took, the exact specifications of the trip varied in technical terms and in literal terms. Well, for starters, the first difference you're going to notice is that the menu is just a static gray image of the Half-Life 2 logo. Burton Equation was apparently set up for achievements in this time, something that the current build isn't, but there are no achievements you can earn in either the July 2020 or February 2021 builds. By default, you can select the 6 levels of the Noir campaign, and in the final game, you can only select the first level of each of the 4 campaigns. You have to work your way to the other levels by playing through them. You can also use the console in the final game to get to the levels, and also the Half-Life 2 Episode 1 and Episode 2 levels, but those are just kind of side effects of it being an Episode 2 mod. Interestingly, the other campaigns are still accessible in the early builds. You just have to use the developer console to load them up. The VOs are there for the most part. More content is finished on the February 2021 build, but I'll cover the specifics of that compared to the July one when we get down to the nitty-gritty differences. The level design is a lot more basic, a lot more of point A to point B fighting. The detailing and environmental art is more just brushwork, more of large boxes and things like that are given the textures of buildings. This isn't on par with the big cityscapes and vast war zones of the final game's levels, but that's expected. This is just a proof of concept, it feels like, going through the levels and fighting enemies in them. Same stuff is going on pretty much, fighting the Metro gang across time, but what sets it apart is that the levels actually have different layouts to some degree. They don't exactly play the same way. The mechanics are also a little different. There's no kick button in either of the early builds. There aren't any power-ups in either of the early builds. And also, some of the ways that the enemy encounters go are different. The Fabrine boss fight is different in the Noir campaign. And the holdouts, the radio tower fight in the Sepia campaign is different too. The helicopter boss in Miami is mostly the same, and Terminus is not finished in the July 2020 build. If you actually try to play through it, you'll find that a couple of the level triggers are broken, or they are not finished, so you have to manually load up the next levels for 3 and 4. Level 5 is present, but only the basics of it are done. Like, you load in to the void, and you need a no-clip to get back in the level. And even if you go to the main starting area, you can't get past the initial ladder. And if you get through that, you find that the level is very basically decorated and very dark, so you have to turn on matte full bright in order to get a glimpse of everything. The basic layout of the Strider Plaza is there, along with a stand-in for the main building you enter, but it's mostly done with environmental textures, the very basic developer stuff. It looks neat though. I mean, it's kind of cool to explore the bare bones idea of what the level could have been when you compare it to the final version, where it's this massive cityscape that's been turned into this war zone. It's cool. Now, let's talk enemies. They're basically the same. Not a lot of differences, really. The basic gist of the enemy designs are there. The only differences are in the frequency of them. Sepia, the 1940s, they have issues with lots and lots of enemies popping up. I can tell they toned it down in the final game, especially with the hunters. The hunters are rare enemies in the 1940s in the final game, but in both builds, they are very present and very aggressive, and they do not let you breathe. Interestingly, in these builds, there's one weapon that is used by enemies and is usable by the player that isn't in the final build, and that's a mounted MG42. It shoots pulse beams, so it's basically a reskin of the mounted combine turret, but it's still pretty cool. It shows up in the final battle in the radio tower, in this case where you have to plant dynamite and hold out against waves of enemies until it finally goes off. Now for the characters. You still have Detective Zachary Burton as the protagonist. The voice actor is different. The deliveries in the beta voiceovers are kind of rough. I mean, they are first takes, basically. They're there for the groundwork and proof of concept. You can compare the tone and the overall delivery very easily from the early versus the final.
The Metro gang was more prepared for more than I thought. I knew they were camped right outside my door, waiting for me to make the wrong move. But I hadn't expected this. I've got to go through the old warehouse district. Fabrine's base of operations is right in the middle of it. The gang is armed like I thought they would be, mostly pistols. Though one of them did have a Thompson. I guess I'll have to hope he was the only one.
The Metro gang were more prepared than I thought. I knew they were just waiting for me to make a move. But they have the streets locked down. Gotta take the fight to them in the warehouse district. That's the hole Fabrine's dug himself into. Smack dab in the middle. The gang is armed to the damn teeth. Military surplus, automatics. Yeah. I think a bit of confiscation is in order.
The July 2020 build lacks the comic loading screens, but the February 2021 build has them. Also, there are some voiceovers that are missing in the July 2020 build, but they are present in the February 2021 build. There are also some differences in the way the characters are. Fabrine actually dies in the Noir chapter. You don't pursue him across time in this. The Metro gang is still a threat, but I guess it's implied they have other leaders and other people that are helping them out. Burton just goes down believing that the Metro gang are dealt with. Like, even the text after you kill Fabrine basically says, like, I'll just head back to my office now. Except it gets complicated because the Metro gang hound him every step of the way. I believe that the creator said that he wanted there to be, like, a different antagonist in each time zone before it was simplified to just Fabrine to make it a more personal fight. What's different is also that Detective Burton is a World War I veteran in the final game, but he isn't in the beta, and he mentions that he hadn't actually been to the trenches before, but he had heard about them.
The trenches were muddy, close quarters, and brutal. I've heard that trenches in the Great War were like this. I never hoped I'd get a first-hand invitation to experience it.
I never wanted to be back in these fucking trenches. I had enough. Slipping through the mud. Slipping through the dirt and the bodies. Fighting someone else's war. For no goddamn reason.
I like this change. I think it gives him a lot more personal stakes to make him a World War I veteran. Same with Fabrine. It gives him a personal reason to be disgusted with falling back into another world war. And it also explains his combat experience and everything else. And it makes his observations about the 1940s enemies interesting. And on that note, this is a bit of a minor change, but still kind of neat. The Magnum is actually a 38 revolver in the final game, but in the original builds it was a 357 revolver. There's a reason for this. If you want to be technical, the 357 Magnum round was only invented in the 1930s and no order set in the 20s. So it could just be they're sticking to, the proper timeline of sorts. Burton hadn't dealt with any time travel shenanigans up until we fought the Metro Gang, so it would make sense that his sidearm would be a 38 if he really is in the 1920s. And judging by the presence of the M1927 Thompson, it's probably the latter 20s. So, on the note of guns, you can see them being more refined as the builds go on, but it's basically the same arsenal. The vision for it, much like with the levels, is basically the same. The biggest differences are in terms of sounds and other designs. Some guns lack their secondary features, like the Glock, the USP Match, and the Mac 11. They all lack their burst fire options. The OICW isn't in the July 2020 build, and even though it is in the February 2021 build, it doesn't have the zoom, and it's basically a reskin of the modified Thompson, the laser one, because it uses the same ammo and it shoots the pulse spheres instead of its grenades. The modified Thompson and the regular Thompson don't have firing sounds in the July 2020 build. The regular Thompson lacks reload sounds completely, and the modified Thompson only has partial reload sounds done. These issues are rectified by the February build. The Luger, its sounds come out of the left side of the screen in July 2020. This is fixed in February. The MP40 is insanely loud in July, and in February this was reduced to a more reasonable sound. The Half-Life 2 RPG, the AT4, isn't in either of the beta builds. The July 2020 and February 2021 builds just have the Stinger and the Panzerschreck. Speaking of the Panzerschreck, it doesn't have the Tesla-looking shield that the final game gives it. It has the regular blast shield, the metal one, sort of like how it is in the comic for the latter 1940s chapters. This is an issue, though, because it covers up a lot of the screen in the process, and it makes it tough to aim because it's angled at the center of the screen. I see why they changed this, not just for the aesthetics, but also to let players get a clear shot of what they're aiming at. It's easy to miss the rockets in the early builds because of the blast shield blocking your line of sight, whereas in the final game there's only that sort of electrical field that you can easily see through. It makes a big difference for actually landing hits, and it's necessary when the hunters are so powerful. When you compare the July 2020 to February 2021 builds, there are some other differences that I haven't covered yet. There are some improvements in terms of level layout and design, fixing sound issues and things of that sort. There are more levels present in the February 2021 build. The Strider Plaza and Finale levels of Terminus are present. Terminus has a unique boss fight, actually, in this build. In the final game you fought Fabrine in a basic deathmatch of sorts where he has backup, and every time you would land significant damage on him, the period would shift slightly. In the February build, it's different. I guess to reflect the fact that Fabrine wasn't meant to be the antagonist for any of the other time periods. In that case, you're actually going through this large open-air, sort of like citadel-like environment And there are these computers that are mounted on various high points as you're trying to ascend it. And you need to break the glass on all of them and reach the top one to destroy them and to win the game. The ending is also different. In the final game, after Burton defeats Fabrine and they decide to destroy the timeline together, Burton goes down in his monologue believing he's died, but there's a post-credit scene where he wakes up in his office with the woman who recruited him there waiting for him. There's no dialogue exchanged, but the implication is that he did actually survive the final explosion. In the beta, that never happens, and it's pretty much all but said that he dies in that confrontation. Also, the zombies map in Terminus. In the February build, there are voice files for Burton taunting the zombies whenever he would land kills.
Die, you bloodsucker!
These files are still present in the final game, but they go unused. And the voice actor hadn't been changed, so I'm guessing they were just leftovers. I don't think they were going to be used in the final game. It's probably for the best, because Burton is genuinely disgusted and horrified by what he sees in the next level's narration. So it wouldn't make sense for him to go from dropping one-liners to being disgusted with the Metro Gang for dropping head crabs on people and turning them into monsters. Outside of that, the music is different. The music is different across the board from the July and February builds to the final game. In fact, the music is a great way to get copyright struck if you're playing the beta versions, so that's why it's muted here. The final game you can play the music, but you're not gonna be able to monetize it. But the songs are completely different for some levels. I mean, the basic vibes are still there, it's just that the composers and the songs are different. It is neat to hear, admittedly, but it's something I guess that artists aren't always on board the entire way. If they decide to back out during a project, all you can really do is move on and find replacements. And I guess that's what happened here. All things considered, it's pretty impressive how the Burton Equation shaped up and refined itself. It's also impressive how the general gist of the mod was always present. It was just aspects of it were improved, and the vision was narrowed and focused, and it turned into this really cool mod for Half-Life 2. I had a blast going through the beta builds, even if they're rough, I'll admit that, but I knew that going into it. These are well before the initial releases, so I didn't expect, groundbreaking stuff. This isn't like the Vienna builds of Manhunt 2, where there would be totally different levels that were cut and so on and so forth. This was a mod that knew what it wanted to do from start to finish. It just had to figure out the specifics in order to reach the point of completion. And I'm glad it did, because I've had a great time going through it. And I had a fun time going through the beta builds as well. So thank you to the person who sent them to me. Thank you to Kralik, the creator of the mod, for being okay with this. I appreciate you being a bro about it, because I know digging through older content, it can seem kind of embarrassing, but this was meant to be a genuine compliment of a video. I like the Burton Equation a lot, and I think it's really cool how it really shaped up and grew as time went on. How the basic idea of it just kind of stayed the same, but the finer aspects of it were improved, which led to it being a really fun experience. So thank you for that, and thank you all for watching. I hope you give the Burton Equation a shot. It's really good, and I'm looking forward to patch 1.2. It should come out sometime in February of this year. Take care.